Your brain literally shrinks in specific regions if you're a psychopath. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, we're talking measurable structural differences that show up on brain scans. Today, we're diving deep into the science behind psychopathy, exploring what cutting-edge neuroscience reveals about how these minds actually work, and why the nature versus nurture debate is way more complex than anyone imagined. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the real biological markers of psychopathy and why everything you think you know about born versus made might be wrong.
So let's start with something that might surprise people. Psychopathy isn't actually an official diagnosis in the DSM-5. It falls under antisocial personality disorder, but researchers use something called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR, to measure it. This 20-item assessment creates two main dimensions that are fascinating when you look at the brain science.
Wait, 2 dimensions? I thought psychopathy was just one thing.
That's exactly the misconception we need to break down. The first dimension is called the interpersonal active factor. Think superficial charm, deceitfulness, emotional coldness. The second is the lifestyle antisocial factor. Impulsivity, poor behavioral controls, antisocial actions. And here's where it gets really interesting. These two dimensions show completely different patterns in the brain.
Different brain patterns? How so?
A recent study published in the European Archives of Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience examined 39 male psychopathic subjects using advanced brain imaging. They found that the antisocial behavior dimension showed strong negative associations with brain volume in areas like the pons, basal ganglia, thalamus, and crucially, the orbitofrontal and dorsolateral frontal cortices.
Those are the areas responsible for behavioral control, right?
Exactly. These findings suggest dysfunctions in specific frontal subcortical circuits that are known to be relevant for behavioral control. But here's what's fascinating. The interpersonal affective traits showed only weak associations with brain structure, indicating that different individuals might be affected to variable degrees.
So the impulsive, antisocial stuff has clear brain markers, but the manipulative, charming traits don't?
That's a really good way to put it. And when they compared psychopathic subjects to controls, they found significantly reduced total brain volume in the psychopathic group. But the regional differences were actually quite variable between individuals, suggesting there's no single psychopath brain pattern.
This is blowing my mind. So we can literally see structural differences, but it's not as simple as we thought.
Right, and this connects to some really important genetic research. The strongest evidence for a genetic pathway involves something called the low-expression variant of the monoamine oxidase A gene, or MAOA, which is linked to the X chromosome. But there are also other genetic factors like the 5-HTT gene and dopamine receptor genes.
The MAOA gene, isn't that sometimes called the warrior gene?
That's the popular term, though it's a bit misleading. Research shows the predisposition of psychopathy is nearly 50% from parents to offspring, and it's been linked to abnormal glucose metabolism and specific neurotransmitter systems. A 2020 study by Tihonen found robust alterations in gene expression that were specific for psychopathy.
50% hereditary? That's huge. But wait, if it's that genetic, why are we talking about environmental factors?
This is where the research gets really interesting and challenges a lot of assumptions. A comprehensive review by Fraser and colleagues found that psychopathy research has largely ignored developmental evidence demonstrating significant influences of environment on both biological and behavioral processes.
So we've been missing half the picture?
Essentially, yes. The review concluded that while some promising evidence exists regarding neurobiological processes, this evidence is insufficient to suggest a largely biological etiology for the disorder. Environmental factors, particularly adversity and traumatic stress, are common correlates of psychopathy.
That's a pretty significant finding. So even with all these brain differences and genetic markers, we can't say it's just biology?
Exactly. The research suggests complex, multidimensional trajectories. Think about it. We know psychopaths are often considered born, while sociopaths are seen as made through environmental factors like childhood trauma. But the reality is much more nuanced.
Speaking of sociopaths versus psychopaths, how different are they really?
Great question. According to research, psychopaths are typically calculated, cold, and manipulative, often maintaining a superficial normal life. So sociopaths are usually more erratic, impulsive, and prone to emotional outbursts. Psychopaths struggle less with holding jobs or relationships because they're better at masking their condition.
So psychopaths are basically better at hiding it?
In many ways, yes. And this connects back to the brain research. Studies using neuroimaging found reduced gray matter density and orbital cortex inactivity in psychopathic individuals, areas responsible for processing emotions and empathy. But these individuals can still function in society, sometimes quite successfully.
That's terrifying and fascinating at the same time. How common is this condition?
Psychopathy is extremely rare. Only about 0.5 to 1% of the general population meets the criteria. It's also much less common among women. Around 11% of female violent offenders meet the criteria, compared to 31% of male violent offenders.
So it's predominantly male and quite rare. But when it does occur, the research shows it's one of the strongest predictors of violent behavior, right?
Absolutely. The research is clear that psychopathy represents one of the strongest predictors of aggressive and violent behavior. Individuals with strong psychopathic traits commit more crimes, cause greater injuries, and have a higher risk of recidivism compared to non-psychopathic subjects.
The recidivism part is particularly concerning. Does this mean treatment doesn't work?
That's been the traditional view, but recent research is more optimistic. A 2025 study in Scientific American discussed new treatments that help reduce callous and unemotional traits in children, potentially guiding them toward productive lives. The key seems to be early intervention.
Early intervention makes sense if we're talking about developmental factors. But how do you even diagnose this in children?
It's incredibly complex and controversial. The research shows that psychopathic traits often emerge in adolescence, but diagnosing children requires extreme caution. The focus is more on identifying callous and unemotional traits early and providing appropriate interventions.
This brings up something interesting. If psychopathy has been studied since Cleckley's 1941 book, The Mask of Sanity, why are we still learning so much?
That's a great observation. The field has been dominated by quantitative studies, but a recent review argues for more qualitative approaches. The flexibility of qualitative methods could capture unanticipated or nuanced aspects that structured measures might miss.
So we need to actually listen to people with psychopathy to understand them better?
Exactly. The review mentions the first contemporary theory on secondary psychopathy etiology and the first ever treatment studies exploring differential outcomes between variants. We're finally recognizing that there might be different types of psychopathy requiring different approaches.
Different types? Can you explain that?
The research distinguishes between primary and secondary psychopathy. Primary psychopathy is more associated with those genetic factors we discussed, the MAOA gene variants, the brain structural differences. Secondary psychopathy appears more linked to environmental trauma and adverse experiences.
So we're back to nature versus nurture, but now it's more like nature and nurture creating different pathways?
That's a perfect way to frame it. The research on epigenetics suggests that environmental factors can actually influence gene expression. So even if someone has genetic predispositions, their environment can determine whether and how those traits manifest.
Epigenetics, so trauma or adverse experiences could literally change how genes work?
Exactly. This is why the field is moving toward trauma-informed care approaches. The 2025 research updates emphasize how genetic and epigenetic factors interact with childhood trauma to shape psychopathy. It's not just about having the genes, it's about what happens to activate or suppress them.
This completely changes how we think about prevention and treatment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If we understand that environmental factors play such a crucial role, then early intervention in high-risk environments becomes critical. We can't change someone's genes, but we can potentially change their environment and experiences.
But here's what I'm struggling with. If psychopaths have reduced empathy and emotional processing, how do you even reach them therapeutically?
That's the million-dollar question. Traditional therapy approaches that rely on empathy and emotional connection obviously face challenges, but the research suggests that cognitive behavioral approaches focusing on practical consequences rather than emotional appeals might be more effective.
So instead of how would you feel if someone did this to you, it's more like, here are the concrete consequences of this behavior?
Exactly. And the brain research supports this approach. Since the areas involved in behavioral control show the strongest associations with psychopathic traits, interventions that strengthen these neural pathways through practice and repetition might be more promising than emotional appeals.
It's like training a different part of the brain to compensate for the deficits?
That's a great analogy. And this is where the research on children becomes so important. Young brains are more plastic, more capable of forming new neural pathways. Early intervention could potentially help develop compensatory mechanisms before patterns become entrenched.
But this raises ethical questions too, doesn't it? How do you identify at-risk children without stigmatizing them?
You're absolutely right. The research emphasizes the importance of focusing on behaviors and providing support rather than labeling. It's about addressing callous and unemotional traits through positive interventions, not about predicting who will become a psychopath.
And I imagine the media portrayals don't help with the stigma. Most people think of Hannibal Lecter when they hear psychopath.
Exactly. The research shows that while psychopathy is associated with increased risk of violence, not all psychopaths are violent criminals. Some function quite well in society, though they may struggle with genuine emotional connections and moral reasoning.
So there could be psychopaths in boardrooms, not just prison cells?
The research suggests that's possible. The superficial charm and manipulative abilities that characterize psychopathy could actually be advantageous in certain environments. But the lack of empathy and moral conscience creates significant problems in personal relationships and ethical decision-making.
This brings us back to that fundamental question. If someone has these brain differences and genetic predispositions, how much control do they really have over their behavior?
That's one of the most challenging questions in the field. The research shows clear biological differences, but it also emphasizes that environmental factors and individual choices still matter. Having a predisposition doesn't determine destiny.
So it's not deterministic, but it's also not entirely a choice?
Exactly. The research suggests we need to move beyond simple either-or thinking. Understanding the biological basis doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does inform how we approach prevention, treatment, and even criminal justice responses.
Speaking of criminal justice, how is this research being applied in legal settings?
The PCLR is widely used in forensic settings to assess risk and inform sentencing decisions, but there's ongoing debate about how much weight biological factors should carry in determining culpability and treatment approaches.
It seems like we're at this fascinating intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and ethics.
Absolutely. And the research is evolving rapidly. The 2025 studies are already showing more nuanced understanding of how genetic, epigenetic, and environmental factors interact. We're moving toward more personalized approaches based on individual risk profiles.
So when you step back from all this research, what's the biggest takeaway about the science behind psychopathy?
The biggest takeaway is that it's far more complex than we initially thought. Yes, there are clear biological markers, brain structural differences, genetic variants, neurotransmitter abnormalities, but environmental factors play a crucial role in how these predispositions manifest.
And that complexity actually gives us more hope for intervention and treatment?
Exactly. If psychopathy were purely genetic and fixed, there would be little hope for change. But understanding the environmental components and the different pathways means we can potentially intervene at multiple points, from early childhood through adulthood.
It also means we need to be more thoughtful about how we approach this as a society, balancing public safety with the potential for rehabilitation.
That's exactly right. The research shows that while psychopathy represents one of the strongest risk factors for violence, it's not an absolute predictor. Understanding the science helps us make more informed decisions about risk assessment, treatment, and prevention.
And for the general public, understanding this science helps us move beyond the Hollywood stereotypes to see the real complexity of human behavior and neurodevelopment.
Absolutely. The research reveals that psychopathy, like many mental health conditions, exists on a spectrum and results from complex interactions between biology and environment. That understanding is crucial for developing effective interventions and reducing stigma.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Remember that brain scan we started with? The one showing structural differences in psychopathic individuals? Now you understand that those differences tell a story not just of biology, but of complex interactions between genes, environment, and development. The science behind psychopathy isn't just about identifying differences, it's about understanding pathways that might lead to better interventions and ultimately better outcomes for everyone involved.